A step closer to Europe. As the EU prepares to scrap visas for Turks, we're looking at the other impacts of the deal. Also on today's programme, backlash against Australia's immigration policy as more than 700 asylum seekers held offshore launch a legal bid to be transferred to Australia. And in picture this, painting the town red, Macedonia's self-declared colour revolution returns to the capital. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garza. The European Commission has recommended that Turks be given visa-free travel in Europe, a key part of a refugee deal between Turkey and the European Union. It had appeared in doubt, with European leaders warning Turkey it had to meet a series of EU requirements before it got the visa waiver. For now, the deal has been conditionally approved, but the European Parliament still needs to vote on it. And one of the architects of the deal, Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu, has announced his departure to maintain party stability. Our newsmaker then is the refugee deal, as we ask if it's bringing Turkey closer to joining the EU or setting it on a course for collision.
It's a deal forged in crisis. Designed to stop refugees coming to the EU. And Turkey has said it will only stop the flow of people if Turks get visa-free travel to Europe's passport-free Schengen zone.
Türkiye'nin Avrupa Birliği'ne olan ihtiyacından daha fazla Avrupa Birliği'nin Türkiye'ye ihtiyacı vardır, bunu böyle.
Bu noktada da en önemli husus geri kabul anlaşmasının devreye girmesiyle birlikte vize muafiyet anlaşmasının da inşallah Haziran ayı içinde devreye girmesi.
EU officials have given their qualified approval, but it still faces a number of obstacles, and an end of June deadline won't definitely be met. Turkey has waited a long time for this, and soon the wait for an EU visa could finally end. The European Commission has now recommended visa-free travel to the Schengen zone. It says Turkey's met most of the required 72 benchmarks, but not yet all of them.
Over the last weeks, Turkey has made impressive progress. There is still work to be done as a matter of urgency. But if Turkey sustains the progress made and continues at the same pace, they can meet the remaining benchmarks.
5 benchmarks still need to be met, and they're in sensitive areas. They include passing measures to prevent corruption, joining the EU's police agency Europol, working with the EU on judicial matters, updating data protection laws, and changing some aspects of anti-terror laws. Turkey is also expected to continue taking back people denied asylum in Europe and to crack down on people smugglers. Since the refugee deal was signed in March, the number of people arriving on Greek islands has dramatically reduced. But some in Europe fear a new influx of Turkish migration. Not so, say Turkey's diplomats.
There is no rush that will come to the EU, so they should not have any fear. In fact, there will be travelers coming with a lot of money to spend, and hopefully they'll help the economy of the EU.
The deal is by no means complete. It still needs to be approved by the European Parliament and EU member states. Ahmet Davutoglu, a key architect of the visa plan, has just announced he's stepping down as Prime Minister. And that too might raise further doubts over whether the refugee deal and visa liberalisation will definitely go ahead. Duncan Crawford, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me in studio to discuss the latest developments in Turkey's pursuit to join the European Union is Cigdem Naas, Secretary General of the Economic Development Foundation. Also joining us is Deutsche Welle's Beirut Correspondent Martin Jay. And in Brussels is the Director of the European Neighbourhood Council, Samuel Doveri Vesterbye. All of you, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Martin Jay. Do you believe that the European Commission is doing this happily or begrudgingly?
I think there's an agenda there from the very beginning to save its own neck. You have to remember that right now the European Union is at a crisis point in terms of credibility, not only with member states but also people around Europe. Many people are asking themselves, what is the point of the European Union when, in fact, even the very basis of it, free movement of people, is now looking as though it's falling apart. The Schengen Agreement, for example, seems to be coming away at the seams. So I think there is a deal there, and the deal is very much for the European Commission to save its own neck at a very difficult time when the credibility is at an all-time low.
Cigdem Naas, do you believe that the deal will pass?
Yes, I think so, because this deal is part of the refugee deal between Turkey and the European Union. And stemming the flow of migrants to the EU is one of the priorities at the moment, especially for the protection of the Schengen area. Since Turkey also demands that visa liberalization enters into force in return for its cooperation in the refugee deal, I think it will pass, although maybe there may be some problems. Still, at the end of the day, I think it will pass.
Samuel, Cigdem Naas says that the refugee deal hinges on this, which raises the stakes, and this is why it's so important. Do you believe that the entire refugee deal hinges on this?
I mean, it is part of the deal. I mean, visa liberalization was seen as a tit-for-tat move on behalf of the European Commission and the Turkish government. I mean, I think in terms of the development of visa liberalization, Turkey's done a pretty reasonable job. I think they've probably been working around the clock since March. Only recently we saw the European Commission report stating that they've actually done a very good job in terms of closing all the different articles that they had to finish, harmonizing with the acquis communautaire. I think it's reasonably positive.
Samuel, Brussels still have human rights, freedom of speech, and corruption worries. That's why there's some opposition. Will the doubters be satisfied with where things are come June? Do you really believe that?
I think in terms of human rights and democracy, these are issues that Turkey has had for some time. They've had quite a lot of criticism from the European Commission. But at the same time, I mean, it's only through engagement with Turkey that you then improve the situation.
Martin Jay?
The European Commission is not in a position, I think, in my view, to talk about human rights and to make those kind of aspersions or judgment calls. If you go back to 2006 and 2005, when Romania and Bulgaria, for example, were lining up to join the European Union, the argument then was that these countries have appalling human rights records. They have judiciaries completely run by mafia, and corruption is almost in industrial quantity, that some of them are even considering exporting it. Now, the argument in Brussels at that time, because I was in Brussels covering the European Union for a number of British newspapers at the time, the argument was, well, we'll bring these countries in, and then when they get in, then we'll be able to reform them, and we'll be able to reform some of these huge problems such as corruption. And so the argument I've just heard doesn't really stand up. I think you need to be a bit more pragmatic about it. The European Union doesn't really care, to be honest, about human rights and freedom of speech. I mean, you only got to spend a few years in Brussels to see that. So I don't think that's really on the agenda when we talk about Turkey.
Let me ask Cigdem Naas, is the visa deal or the visa-free deal just the appetizer, and are we going to see Turkey's European Union accession? Are you convinced of that?
I'm not yet convinced, although we have seen an acceleration of the process. We have seen a new chapter opened, and now a new chapter will be opened in June. So this is better than nothing, but still we have major blockages on the accession process, which are mainly tied to the Cyprus issue. So maybe we will have to wait. If there is a successful conclusion of the Cyprus talks, then it will make a much more positive impact on the accession process. But still, I think Turkey and the European Union came closer because this is a very major area of cooperation, the refugee deal and also the visa issue. So it has, I think, created a new atmosphere which is linked to a growth of trust and cooperation in the relations. So that is important. So maybe, although we do not see it now, in the future, if also Turkey has some reforms or concludes some reforms in the political sphere, then it may also have a positive impact on the accession prospects, but not as yet.
Let me pivot a little bit and go back to Samuel here. We've just had just about an hour and a half as we speak to digest the news that Prime Minister Ahmed Davutoglu will be stepping down. Now, this was his baby. He was the face of this deal in the negotiations with the Europeans. We saw him with Angela Merkel. Will the deal be affected, and how has this gone down so far in Brussels? Is there a buzz about this? Do they feel as if the deal will be affected?
I mean, I think everyone is moderately concerned by leadership change in Turkey when so much is at stake. That goes without a saying. At the same time, you also have to remember that leadership changes occur everywhere. They're a normal part of any political system. And the only thing we can hope for is that someone credible and with legitimate understanding of the European Union comes in place. Let me just quickly get back to what we spoke about before, though. I think it's quite important to remember that in terms of engagement with Turkey, I mean, what we saw throughout the last maybe since 2007 until now has been a slowdown in the accession process. There's been a lot of concern from European countries. There's been a lot of disassociation. They weren't so interested. But things are changing quite dramatically. Germany, a country that hasn't had much of a foreign policy, is slowly realizing the potential of Turkey in realistic terms. And I think the engagement of Turkey is something we're going to see a lot more of.
Let's ask the Deutsche Welle correspondent. Is that an accurate explanation of the German position right now?
I think he's probably on the money. Yeah, I think there is a realization in Germany now that Turkey is not quite the threat, in inverted commas, that it perhaps was when I was in Brussels in 2000 and the president of Turkey turned up and was treated like a superstar in the European Parliament. We had helicopters in the air and motorcades, and it was an extraordinary moment of the starter's pistol to accession. But you've also got to look at other elements going on here. It's not only Germany. It won't be the European Commission. The European Commission doesn't have the right even to offer accession to Turkey, and doesn't even have the right to sign it off when it finally happens. That will happen with member states. That will happen with the giants of Europe, Britain, France and Germany.
At the moment, as things stand, who needs whom more, Turkey or the European Union?
Yes, I think it's mutual. I mean, the EU needs Turkey because, it has an existential crisis because of the refugee issue linked to the Schengen area, the protection of the Schengen borders. So I think it needed Turkey more, but Turkey also has a more maybe fundamental need for the European Union, especially after the disturbances started in its neighborhood, especially in the Middle East, in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. I think it has seen that its European connection is very important. It has to stay part of the West, and it cannot engage in any adventures in its near neighborhood. So for its democracy and also for its economy, it needs the European Union. So I think Turkey's maybe need for the European Union is more comprehensive. The EU's need is linked to the solution of its problems. So I think there is a mutual need now, and the conjuncture has also shown that this happened simultaneously, and it crystallized within the perspective of the refugee crisis.
Okay, just about enough time to scoop up some final thoughts from Martin and Samuel. Let me ask you the same question then. Let's start with you, Martin. Who needs whom more?
Oh, no question. And from my perspective, I think the European Union needs Turkey much more than Turkey needs the European Union. I mean, there is this euphoria about joining the European Union, but the European Union, let's not forget, is a trading bloc which doesn't have any economic growth compared to other trading blocs around the world. With the way things are looking now, we don't even know if it'll be around in the future. To join the European Union, where Turkey will have to sign up to thousands of directives which will affect its industry, which will affect foreign investment, which will affect so many things. I think the Turks shouldn't be asking themselves that question now. What I would argue is Turks should be asking, what do we get out of European Union membership? I mean, the dream ticket, which Eurosceptics in Britain and perhaps in some Scandinavian countries would say, is why not stick with this visa arrangement and forget about accession and get the best deal that you can possibly get for Turkey without signing up to the whole deal.
Interesting point. Samuel, final thoughts, please.
Yeah, I mean, final thoughts on this are pretty straightforward. I think the European Union needs Turkey as much as Turkey needs the European Union, perhaps a little bit more. At the end of the day, there is very little to do in a world that's dominated by big trade blocs, with increasing insecurity on our borders, things like terrorism. There are only common strategies for these kind of things. There's a reason for why you have a whole school of political thought called transnationalism. That's pretty much the reason to kind of deal with these issues that can't be dealt nationally. So most of the things that you see in national politics today are due to kind of domestic elections and so on. But if you take a purely rational choice perspective, of course Turkey and the EU need each other. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, Samuel, Martin and Cigdem, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, a new challenge to Australia's offshore detention centres. And in picture this, Macedonian protesters stay out all night over a corruption scandal. A boat carrying asylum seekers has reached a remote Australian territory, the first such arrival in nearly 2 years. Australia has a tough immigration policy, sending all asylum seekers intercepted at sea to offshore detention centres. It says it needs to be strict to deter people from making the dangerous journey. But critics say the policy is inhumane. The Newsmakers' Soraya Lennie reports.
It is fundamentally wrong to condemn these people to a life in limbo.
We are not going to allow people to drown at sea again.
The people smugglers will not prevail.
It is a policy that is hurting people, breaking people. That is exactly what it is designed to do.
It's one of the most contentious issues in Australian politics. It's Australian policy to house asylum seekers who enter the country illegally by boat in offshore detention centres. Even if they are found to be refugees, the government does not allow them to settle in Australia. Human rights groups say the policy is barbaric. But according to polls, most Australians support at least part of the policy. Australia's tough stance on migration is not new. John Howard's Conservative government introduced the so-called Pacific Solution in 2001. The aim was to stop asylum seekers crossing by boat from Indonesia. The government then opened 3 offshore camps, one in Nauru, one on Christmas Island, and another in Manus Island, Papua New Guinea. At the time, this policy was popular with voters. When Labor leader Kevin Rudd won the federal election in 2007, he largely dismantled the program, but his successor Julia Gillard quickly backtracked.
Why would you get on a boat, pay your money, risk your life, if the outcome was you ended up back in the regional processing centre?
And when Labor lost power to the Conservatives in 2013, Tony Abbott only hardened the policy. The Australian government says the policy is working and deaths at sea remain low. Still, it's dogged by controversy and court cases.
This is a policy in freefall.
An asylum seeker has been murdered in custody, while 2 others have set themselves on fire within days of each other.
What we're wrestling with as a nation is not a legal question. It's a moral question.
Protests have broken out across the country against mandatory detention, specifically that of children. Now, Papua New Guinea's Supreme Court has ruled that the Manus Island Detention Centre is in breach of the country's constitution and it could be forced to close.
And no action advocates or those in regional processing countries take will cause the government to deviate from its course.
All this is building up, just 2 months away from a federal election in Australia, where for the past 15 years, migration policy has been the make or break issue. Soraya Lennie, The Newsmakers.
And Soraya is with me in the studio for more analysis of this story. Soraya, as you mentioned, the polls. This policy is controversial, but it's still popular in Australia. Why?
One of the reasons is to do with, according to analysts, that, Australia is an island. It's not like Europe where you have migration coming and going and this free movement of people. So there is apparently this island kind of mentality where the borders should always be secure, and they are a very privileged kind of people and a privileged kind of nation, and therefore those who are allowed in should be a select few people. This is the general thinking, according to a lot of analysts and according to a lot of polls, of the people. It's something that you see very much at election time. It's something that we saw with the introduction of the Pacific solution in 2001. Keep in mind that came after September 11 in a very heightened, polarized atmosphere in which the government was very much using this kind of atmosphere, and two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in which Australia participated effectively to rally people behind this idea that they must get tougher on immigration, specifically illegal migration and what the government refers to as boat people.
Now we're seeing Australian employees at these detention centres are banned from speaking to the media. When we have seen images come out of Manus and Nauru, we've seen some horrific images from the detention centres. There's the self-immolations. With all of that, are we seeing pushback from within Australia now?
Well, it's a very good question. Whenever there are these issues or these incidents that actually do get reported on in, say, the self-immolations, for example, and the murder of the young asylum seeker not that long ago, and the conviction of two men over that death, we do see more discourse within the community. And it really is, though, at more of a community level rather than at a policy-making level or a higher level. So there is this discourse amongst the Australian population and questioning whether or not this is right. However, the polls don't necessarily reflect this kind of discourse or discussion just yet. Perhaps it's going to take some time to catch up because, as you mentioned, the majority of Australians still support offshore detention and also turning back boats that arrive illegally into Australian territorial waters.
Now, finally, sort of looking ahead and looking at some of the things that are happening right now, there's that legal bid from those hundreds of people. Manus Island is on Papua New Guinea. The Papua New Guinea Supreme Court ruled the detention centre there illegal. There's a Spanish firm that bought a majority stake in both the detention centres. They don't want to continue running these centres. So what's going to happen then? Do we know what the Australian government's policy is going to be when those things sort of come to fruition?
Well, the question or the answer, I suppose, is, well, not really. They have a couple of options, though. If they close Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, which looks very likely, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea has already basically said this is going to happen. The court has already ruled it unconstitutional and illegal. Australia still has Nauru and Christmas Island as offshore detention centres. So the theory is they're going to be sending the 700 to 800 people who are in Manus Island at the moment to these other centres. Now, Nauru is probably the most controversial. It's what Human Rights Watch calls the conditions there toxic, dangerous for basically anybody who would be sent there, let alone children and women, for example. And also, they also have processing centres on the mainland. But if the government does that and sends people to the mainland, they're effectively going against their own policy. And it's a policy that not only the Conservative government holds, but the opposition holds, and they're 2 months out from an election. So a change of policy now would be probably a little bit controversial. But at the same time, they may not actually have much of a choice.
Interesting times ahead. Okay, Soraya, it was good getting a deeper dive into this story with you. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
In today's Picture This, anti-government protesters are back on the streets of Macedonia, repeating their demand for the president to step down. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been the refugee deal, as we asked if it's bringing Turkey closer to joining the European Union. Although visa-free travel is possibly the most significant step so far on Turkey's path towards the European community, it's raised a number of issues. And the biggest hurdle may be ahead, as the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers must approve this visa waiver. They maintain they will not do so unless Turkey meets all of the EU's criteria. It's a difficult time for all those involved, and the entire refugee deal will be at risk unless these differences are overcome. And without the deal, Turkey's hopes of joining the EU will take a step back again. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.